Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Millard Fillmore, and the focus is leading citizen of Buffalo. The year is 1856, and Fillmore's political career has come to an end. He had recently run at the top of the know-nothing ticket in the 1856 presidential election. He just won one state, Maryland, 8 electoral votes, that was all. James Buchanan won the presidency quite easily, and that was it for Millard Fillmore. Still trying to figure out now what to do with himself. Feels like he can't really just get a regular job. That's not really appropriate for an ex-president. He wants to make some money because he's comfortable, but he's certainly not wealthy. And he's really kind of annoyed at the fact that the country doesn't really know what to do with its ex-presidents. According to Fillmore, it is a national disgrace that our president should be cast adrift and perhaps be compelled to keep a corner grocery for subsistence. We elect a man to the presidency, expect him to be honest, to give up a lucrative profession perhaps, and after we have done with him, we let him go into seclusion and perhaps poverty. Well, Fillmore wasn't a fan of this. He didn't enjoy it himself. In fact, he thought the American people should reward presidents with a pension, maybe half their salary for the rest of their life. Such a move, a pension, would come to U.S. presidents, but not for another 100 years. Well, Millard Fillmore did remain active, not in politics, not in work, but in his community, and his social and his personal life also underwent an evolution. It had been 4 years since Fillmore had lost his wife, Abigail, who passed away just after his presidency came to an end, and he started seeing Caroline McIntosh, a wealthy widow from the region, and they got pretty close pretty fast. This was not necessarily the same passionate relationship that Fillmore was believed to have had with his first wife, Abigail, but it was a very strong relationship, a comfortable bond, a lot of shared interests. They enjoyed each other's company, and in fact, they did decide to get married February 10th, 1858. First, though, they had to sign a prenuptial agreement, not to protect his assets, but to protect hers. She was the one really with all the money, as her husband, quite wealthy, had died just a couple of years before, and so Fillmore had to sign that he would not access her funds without her permission. It never turned out to be a problem. One of the issues they did have to confront, though, was where to live. She was well established in the community in Albany. His roots had gone very, very deeply in Buffalo. He was a former president. He did not seem to want to move, and so she relented and sort of reluctantly agreed to move to Buffalo. They weren't going to live in the small Fillmore home. They had other ideas in mind as they used some of her wealth to purchase a mansion on Niagara Street, which became really the center of not only the social center of Buffalo, but all of Western New York. Buffalo was a major hub, right, sitting right there on Lake Erie. Ever since the Erie Canal had come into effect some 30 years before, the region had been completely transformed, and Buffalo had really grown, and Millard Fillmore had been a part of that, and he continued to help lead in its growth. He was a constant volunteer for many, many major causes, philanthropic endeavors. He would be sometimes out front, sometimes behind the scenes. Just some of the examples: he was the first president of the Buffalo Historical Society, the first president of the Buffalo Club, which was one of the first social community organizations within Buffalo. He helped found the Buffalo Fine Arts Academy, making Buffalo just the 4th city in the United States to have its own art museum. He was the president of the Board of Trustees of the Grosvenor Library. He had been on the ground floor establishing the University of Buffalo some quarter century before and had served as its chancellor, mostly an honorary position, but he was always there every year handing out diplomas on the day of commencement. He had been on the Board of Trustees at the First General Hospital of Buffalo. The list goes on and on for the activities for Millard Fillmore in his home community. It wasn't just people, though, that he was out to support. It was also animals. He had been helping to establish the first SPCA, the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals in Buffalo. He served as the first vice president of that organization, and this was very personal to him. He related a story from his youth that he said, "When I was a thoughtless boy, I took the life of a mother bird. I remember my father was greatly grieved and said, 'Millard, do you realize what you have done? You have taken the life of a mother and have left her children to die of starvation in the nest. How would you like to have a great giant come along and kill your father and mother and leave you alone without food or care?' My father's rebuke sank so deeply into my heart that since that day, I never have taken the life of a living creature." Part of his philanthropic and volunteer efforts very much focused on the health of animals. Well, things were not all rosy for Fillmore, as clearly he was very cognizant of the fracture that was occurring in his country. With the election of Abraham Lincoln, a Republican, in 1860, that fracture was now going to be complete. Secession followed, with 7 states voting to leave the Union before Lincoln even took his oath of office. Now, Millard Fillmore was not a fan of the Republican Party. He thought it was a fringe group, a radical group, one that was going to cause problems. He had predicted if the Republicans won the election that civil war would likely come. But he was also strongly against secession. This was anathema to him. He had spent his whole life focusing on the preservation of the Union and the Constitution. He was adamant that that document did not sanction secession. According to Fillmore, that the general government is sovereign admits of no doubt in my mind. The state as such had no authority to secede, and consequently the ordinance of secession was absolutely void, and those pretending to pass it must be regarded as an unauthorized assembly of men conspiring to commit treason, and as such liable to be punished like any other unlawful assembly engaged in the same business. Millard Fillmore supported Lincoln's war effort. He rallied the people in Buffalo to do their duty. He spoke at a pro-Union rally in April of 1861, just after the fall of Fort Sumter, and Abraham Lincoln's call for 75,000 volunteers to come out to try to suppress this rebellion. At the time, Fillmore said that it is no time for any man to shrink from the responsibility which events have cast upon him. We have reached a crisis when no man has a right to stand neutral. Our Constitution is in danger, and we must defend it. It is no time now to inquire by whose fault or folly this state of things has been produced. Rather, let every man stand to his post, and let posterity find our skeleton and armor on the spot where duty required us to stand. Well, Millard Fillmore actually donned a uniform himself. It was part of a group called the Union Continentals that he helped form. Men too old to fight, but still supporting the cause. They helped raise money, recruiting drives. They gathered information to send companies off to war and to welcome them when they were returning to the local community. Now, he was anguished throughout this entire bloody conflict and eventually lost faith in the policies of Abraham Lincoln in terms of the prosecution of the war, such that Millard Fillmore actually supported the Democrat, George McClellan, in the election of 1864, roundly criticized once again in the North. That was nothing new for Millard Fillmore. He did agree with Lincoln's call for a conciliatory approach with the South after victory was secured. According to Fillmore, let us show our magnanimity by winning back the deluded multitude who have been seduced into this rebellion, by extending to them every act of clemency and kindness in our power, and by restoring them to all their rights under the Constitution. This I conceive to be Christian forgiveness and the best policy and the only one which can ever restore this union, very much aligned with Abraham Lincoln's ideas. Of course, after Lincoln was assassinated, things took a very big turn. Well, Millard Fillmore had actually been remarkably healthy his entire life. He was almost never sick. So the end for him eventually came actually rather quickly after he suffered a stroke February 13, 1874, while giving his morning shave. Left him with paralysis on the left side of his left hand, and eventually migrated to the left side of his face. A couple of weeks later, Millard Fillmore suffered a following stroke, and he eventually died March 8, 1874, at the age of 74. Parts of the nation mourned Millard Fillmore, particularly in the South. Some did not, particularly in the North, had never forgiven Fillmore for his signing the Compromise of 1850 into law, the fugitive slave law that was part of that, and he tried to rigorously enforce, not to mention his alignment with the discriminatory Know-Nothing Party in the election of 1856. But Millard Fillmore offered no excuses for these actions, nor apologies. These were consistent in his mind with his primary driver, and that was to preserve the Union and protect the Constitution. He was a strict constructionist to the core, and these were the most elementary parts of his political ideology. And if that meant he had to get in bed with some folks that maybe weren't quite as popular, if he could do it as a possibility to save the Union, avoid war, maintain the Constitution, then he was bound to do it. Where he was challenged, of course, is that the very essence of the path to national fracture was written into the Constitution itself, the roots of slavery and America's original sin. There was simply nothing that he was going to be able to do to stop that fracture from eventually occurring. It didn't occur right at the time of the Constitution. It would take many decades to get there, but eventually it did come, and despite the efforts of folks like Millard Fillmore to avoid it, that path to fracture ultimately was unavoidable. Well, that is Millard Fillmore, and the leading citizen of Buffalo. From the life of Millard Fillmore. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.